Jessica Hunter-Larson. I'm the curator of the Interdisciplinary Arts Program at Colorado College. And I want to welcome you to the first of several events that are kicking off the Atomic Landscapes exhibition, which I hope you've had a chance to check out. The exhibition will be up through May 5th, and we have a lot of really exciting events associated with the exhibition. I'm going to do that thing where before we start this program, I'm going to draw your attention to like the next thing, which is always sort of slightly aggravating, but bear with me. So this is today, panel discussion to open, and then tomorrow we have two events. We have a lunch and lecture with one of our presenters, Eric Lopresti. We still have a couple spaces open for that, so if you're interested, there's information about that in the nifty brochure. And come talk to me if you'd like to sign up. It should be a great talk. And then tomorrow evening, we have a film mashup where a panel of distinguished commenters have chosen atomic-themed films, and they will present clips from those films and discuss them. So it's got a nice variety of films, and it should be a really lively and interesting discussion. So I hope you can come to that as well. And then on Thursday, we're excited to bring Dr. Kristen Iverson here to give a lecture about her experiences growing up near Rocky Flats. She's done some investigative journalism surrounding Rocky Flats and has written a part memoir, part sort of expose on that experience. So let's put today up. So, today we're going to invite several of the artists who are participating in the exhibition and two of our distinguished faculty members to discuss some of the issues that the Atomic Landscapes exhibition brings up. The exhibition is focused on ways in which our cultural anxieties, our persistent desire to wrestle with the history and the legacy of the atomic bomb are maybe reflected in our landscapes, and certainly in the way that we interpret and understand those landscapes. And so we've got a variety of perspectives to comment on that. We've got a couple questions for each of the panelists, and then there'll be some opportunities for you all to ask them questions at the end. So at first, I want to let each of the panelists introduce themselves and maybe briefly talk about how you became interested in this topic of our nuclear history, present, and legacy, and why does it interest you? So, which direction should we start? Right to left, left to right? Jeremy.
My name is Jeremy Boland. I'm an artist and a researcher and educator. I'm faculty at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in the photography department. I guess I became interested in this topic through wanting to understand the idea of the expanded landscape. You know, what was not visible in the landscape, and what the elements of what we cannot perceive. And so I've, throughout the last 5 or 6 years, been investigating that through collaborations with scientists and collaborations with landscapes and all sorts of research and things like that.
Just a quick check with the audience. Would you like the mic to be used, or can you hear? You need the mic?
Okay.
I see yes and no.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Try not to strangle anybody with the microphone.
You have to repeat yourself.
Do I have to? Should I repeat myself? Yeah.
Okay, is this better? Okay, so sorry if this is redundant. My name is Jeremy Boland, School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where I'm faculty in photography. Again, interested in the invisible landscape and how to record what we cannot perceive in the landscape is sort of my entry point to all the work that is in this show and my practice in general.
My name is Eric Lopresti. I live in Brooklyn, New York. I'm a painter
And in this show, I have several paintings, oil and canvas, depicting an underground nuclear test, as well as a couple watercolors. I became interested in this kind of through a back door by just kind of digging into my own subject matter. I was making these large paintings about conflict, human conflict, conflict with nature, and at some point I started asking questions like, well, whose conflict am I really interested in? And I don't know if it's true for every artist, but for me, that question always ends up going back home. So I grew up about 10 miles from the Hanford nuclear site. And at the time, I really didn't know much about it, but now I know some more, and I'm about to learn some more.
I'm Marian Herdigan. I'm a professor in the philosophy department here at CC, and I do a lot of my work is in environmental ethics and environmental philosophy. And I guess I indirectly got interested in issues related to those in the exhibit when I was working for the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute in Missoula, Montana, and I was studying fire management in wilderness, and I came across a report on a site in Indiana that was formerly Jefferson Proving Ground, but converted to Big Oaks National Wildlife Refuge. And there was this little letter, there was the whole report on how they were managing the site, and then there were these citizen comments at the back, and there was this very deferential letter to the managers of the wildlife refuge, questioning their plan to do a prescribed burn at the site because the site was littered with depleted uranium ammunition, and saying, like, could this possibly mobilize any of the radioactivity here? And in any case, I just got really intrigued by some of these places that have these complex layered histories from nuclear sites or military sites to natural areas, and that's been something that's been central to my work in the last few years.
I'm Jeff Trevino, and I'm assistant professor of music and technology here at CC in the Department of Music. And I've always been fascinated with the Cold War because it's, when I talk to my family members or my mentors, it's the closest thing that I could encounter besides my experience of religion. It seemed to be a kind of ghost that everybody had been around before. And I had not experienced it because, growing up, I was rather young when the Berlin Wall fell. I very much experienced the 1990s as a kind of honeymoon period after the Cold War. That was very much my feeling growing up. And so I've always been fascinated by this thing that seemed to be present in the everyday life of a previous generation that was really palpable every day as something that you would experience. And I'm also, as a scholar of music technology, in the same way that Jeremy was describing, fascinated by traces of the seemingly unrecordable. So when we reflect on the Cold War, we often have a predominantly visual representation of things, Einstein's mustache, or the silhouette of an atomic bomb cloud. The sonic traces of that, I think, are less obvious in our memory. In fact, the sonic traces that we might imagine might be actually the failure of sound recording technologies to pick up those sounds with any fidelity. So in teaching my students in the sound art class that's responding to this exhibit, it's a unique challenge to address the kind of visual dimension of the legacy and respond to it with a sonic dimension, whatever that might be. It's not clear.
I'm thankful to be here. I'm thankful all of you are here. So I'm Nina Elder. I'm an artist based in Santa Fe. I'm the residency director at the Santa Fe Art Institute. And my interest in all of this topic began, I grew up spending my summers in the Pecos Mountains in New Mexico, and there was this cabin that everyone referred to as Oppenheimer's cabin, and the doors were open, the windows were open, we could just walk through. And the more I learned, I realized that's Robert J. Oppenheimer, and I found out that my uncle and his father had worked at the Dude Ranch where Oppenheimer had been spending his summers as a child as well, and that led him to return to New Mexico. So I have this incredible disjuncture between growing up in Colorado Springs and the security around NORAD, and then this completely unregulated, beautiful wilderness space that held so much of the Cold War history from kind of a leisure point of view. And so I started looking at the classification of images and the declassification of images, and that's where it started.
I'm Sarah Knaus, and I am also one of the artists in the exhibition, but as my collaborative guise of the National TLC Service, which is a wishful, as in not actually existing yet, government agency that does public memory work around the ongoing effects of the Cold War and the atomic weapons complex, which is anything but over. So I resonate with many of the things that have already been said, and so I'm sort of like, okay, what can I add to this? And I think one of the things that I can add is that I have, for a very, very long time, been interested in cultural traces and making things evident that have very little, that have shaped the landscape, but have left very little visible evidence. I'm very interested in proliferating forms of memory as an embodied and lived experience through dialogue and social collaboration, rather than through the erection of a single monument. I think that there's a lot of ideological work that's been done by the phrase post-atomic or post-Cold War, as if all of these things are safely past and their toxic legacies have been resolved and their political ramifications are sort of over. I think we can look at the horrible bombings that took place this morning as a direct descendant of the political legacies of the Cold War and much of the ways that the United States and the Soviet Union sort of divided up the world as areas where they could have proxy conflicts. So these things are very much with us, and I'm really interested in my practice through this agency in working through these legacies with people who are affected by those in a variety of ways, mostly in the form of embodied illness or in the environmental ramifications in their communities, but environmental and economic ramifications.
Pass it back around. Okay, so my question. So in 1945, with the detonation of the first successful atomic bomb test and the subsequent bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we could safely say that the world changed forever, as destruction on a global scale suddenly became possible. This history and its ramifications are really difficult for us to contemplate. So I want to ask, what strategies do each of you use to engage viewers or students with a topic that is very difficult and challenging? Issues of beauty or humor, research, personal stories, noticed in all of your work. And how did you arrive at those strategies?
A comment on that, I don't know if I'm going to answer specifically for myself, but I've noticed a tendency with artists that are working with topics like this to work with strategies of documentation, so a photo-based practice or recording-based practice. I think that there's a horror greater than we can possibly believe and understand, and so we are depending on something like a camera often, and even in your practice there's photos embedded within the maps to show where these sites are so that we actually can understand it is a reality. So I just wanted to point that out, that I think that that's sort of it seems to be a starting place in all of our work.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to add to that, like this idea of there being some kind of evidence, some sort of medium that can show this this unresolved energy, you know, and that's why I think in approaching it from so many different vantage points, for me, I guess my strategy has been to figure out ways to very simply make the invisible visible in some way, and to make a recording of that, because photography, I guess, photography has a relationship to truth in a certain way, a relationship to evidence, and that's a very complex kind of discussion we could have. But I think there's an interesting kind of desire to figure out ways that we can create this presence, this kind of experience for someone to have, at least with my work, so that you can actually experience something that you cannot otherwise see.
Jeremy, could you explain a little bit the technique that you use?
Yeah, absolutely. So For me, the origins of a lot of the work and the work in this exhibition, doing research on the Manhattan Project, I realized that the workers on the project were wearing badges of photographic film to monitor the radiation they were receiving. And there's a very crude method of they would develop this film every 2 weeks, and if they could read the newspaper through the film, they were okay. But if they couldn't, they weren't okay. I'm not sure what happened if they weren't okay. I don't know if they had any real policy or method to deal with that. So I had been trying to document. Actually, I was trying to document Site A, which is the world's first nuclear reactor. It's buried near Chicago, and I was trying. All of my kind of practice is this idea of site-specific documentation. So I was trying many different methods, and I learned that if I buried film above this reactor, I was burying it for like 2 weeks at a time, I would get reactions. So film that was never exposed to any visible light at all, but it was altered by what was the unresolved energy emanating from this reactor. And that's what I did for a lot of the work in this show too, is I went to Jack Pile Mine, which is the largest uranium mine in the Western Hemisphere at one time when it was operational. And I buried film there. And that's kind of as another kind of piece of this, because it's this very expansive thing that we think about a lot of elements of nuclear weapons, nuclear energy, but then there's the mines that this comes from, and there's where the materials are sourced from, and it's so expansive. So yeah, and then also all my work, I also incorporate the material that was actually at the site. So whether it be dirt that it was buried with or the flora surrounding it, I like to have this tension between the representational and the actual, and to me that sort of gives the viewer a first order experience. You're dealing with not only the representation of the invisible, you're also dealing with the material of the visible world.
I interpreted that question to be, something about the lines of, this is an incredible topic, but how do you get someone interested in something that is has such historical, and is that kind of the question, sort of? Because my feeling taking on this topic, I was very wary actually of, because it's just so interesting. I mean, I don't need to sell it. There's no it's anyone who kind of learns the, a tip of a corner of an iceberg about this nuclear weapons, nuclear technology, quantum physics, all this stuff. It just seems like it snowballs, and my concern was that the subject matter might be too large. So I consider myself a painter, a contemporary painter, and for me the painting comes first. It speaks to the language of contemporary visual art. So with a subject like this, it's like painting, any politically charged subject, you run the danger of being swallowed by it whole. I don't know if anyone else feels that way. Do you want to take the mic?
Sure, I think, getting swallowed whole, that's a really good example of it. My work, I hand harvest radioactive charcoal from around Los Alamos, and that's what I make my drawings out of. And so for me, I'm allowing my physical body to be what is swallowed whole. All of us living in New Mexico and the Southwest have a level of exposure based on Cold War mining, weapons manufacturing, and testing. And I'm just bringing that to a focal point with my own body and to a point with my drawings. And I'm a researcher, but I'm not an expert. But the thing I can be an expert on is kind of how I feel about my environment and how I relate to it, and the level of risk I'm willing to take to bring those conversations to light. And I've received a lot of criticism for my work because it has an element of beauty to it. But I always want to bring it back to that point. This is made out of radioactive charcoal. How beautiful could it be? It's very problematic in that way. So I like to embed that. It's not ironic to be funny. It's ironic to cause empathy in the audience and to open that warm home.
Either way.
I was going to, as far as describing a strategy that I use, we read texts in my class that are ostensibly about aesthetics, kind of manifestos written by artists in the 19-teens, the 1930s, and very quickly those seemingly aesthetic manifestos become critiques of society somehow or take on ethical resonances. So I think one of the ways that I'm preparing my students to participate in the exhibition is by deliberately offering those statements by artists that seem to be deracinated from a broader ethical and social context, and then pointing out how things very quickly fall there. So this morning we were looking at the Futurist Manifesto, for example, and we had an excerpt of that text that excluded a portion that really valorizes war, that points out that because war includes novel, noisy technologies, that there's something glorious about it. So to confront, I think, that weird interstice between ethical action in society and artistic positions is my strategy for getting the students into the topic.
Just say something that was, I was interested as Jeremy was speaking about, like thinking about reflecting back on his work and his project and this idea of burying and then unearthing. And I think that struck me because it seems like one of our approaches to nuclear waste, to the Cold War, has been a kind of burial. And when I was in grad school, actually, one round of grad school, I did a project on INEL, which is this Idaho national, well, they keep changing the name, but like, it's a place in Idaho where they dealt with a lot of nuclear radioactive material. And I was really appalled to learn that for years they just would take like casks of this stuff, they'd dig a trench, they'd put the stuff in a trench, they'd cover it over, and then they'd run it over with bulldozers like to flatten it down, you know, and I'm thinking, wow, like that's a form of burial that seems like we just want to move on, but it's clearly not sufficient. So I think, in dealing with these really difficult issues, I guess I'm interested in sort of doing that unearthing, which, you know, this artwork I think does really well, and and dealing with the complexities of the issue, and also I'm a philosopher, we you know, often deal with arguments in a kind of rational way, but I think there's also very much a kind of affective, emotional dimension of this that we have to confront, and I think there's a real temptation, in the Carrie Norgard, who's a sociologist, has some interesting work on global climate change, where she talks about like the kind of the social construction of denial, and how it's really hard for us to want to think about these things, but I really think the artistic interventions are crucial, because I think they open up a space for that thought in a way that's maybe less threatening and allows us to deal with the affective, and to also kind of be a little less defensive than we might in other contexts.
So I think that I want to kind of tease apart the question of audience in that, and that's sort of implicit in that question. And I think that in my work with the National TLC Service, we have more than one audience. So we have a kind of broader public audience who comes to exhibitions or who sees our website, and who really kind of gets drawn into this sort of parafictional entity. Is it real? Is it not real? Which opens up a space to contemplate like what might be a role of actual governmental public memory work, when the actual government has really done a great deal to try to bury this legacy, literally and culturally. But the audience that is more intimately involved in the project are these stakeholders that we bring together for these community-based design charrettes. So on Saturday we had about 25 people from around the state who represented both pro-uranium mining and anti-uranium mining, longtime anti-nuclear weapons activists with lifelong contractors for the Department of Energy, people who had been inside and inspected every American nuclear weapons plant, you know, in the post-Cold War, or in the Cold War era. And we are really interested in using the space of creativity, design, and visual thinking with people who are non-artists to help to shake up these kind of ossified oppositional positions that people have been clinging on to for decades, because there are really, really high stakes, but also because an identity was forged around this kind of global polarity, right, between the US and the Soviet Union, between where you stood on the side of this issue. And at this point, it's everyone's concern. There's no point in being pro or anti-nuclear. It is here. And so we are really interested in using these tools to get beyond defensiveness and denial to enable a really different kind of conversation to emerge.
I just want to add a comment to that. I was at the San Francisco Art Institute. I was working with a group of undergraduate students talking about consumption and culture and how it's all linked together. And I asked the students, when do you think they weren't thinking about dates, but I said, what generation do you think was most affected by atomic war? And your parents, your grandparents, your great-great-parents, they all selected their great-great-great-great-grandparents. So there's this amnesia, and I mean, not all, but they just weren't thinking about how recent this is. So there's this amnesia on one level, but there's also this distancing, where it's, we know it affects all of us, but we want it to be so much farther in the past than it actually is. Yeah.
I think you might have all answered my follow-up question to that, but I'm going to throw it out there and we can see where it goes. I was really struck when I was curating this exhibition about how beautiful a lot of the artwork that surrounds this very difficult topic is, and thinking about the role of beauty, and we discussed this a little bit, but how it forces you to maybe linger in a place that you would not normally wish to linger, maybe opens you up a little bit to something that is difficult to contemplate. So I wanted to ask a little more generally, in what ways can the arts inform us or enlighten us in ways that didactic information or statistics or figures really can't? And I think you have touched on this, but if you have anything more to say on that topic.
So, anything didactic sounds a little bit maybe not like that much fun anyway. So, it doesn't matter whether it's art or something else. I think that for me, part of the strategy, to go back to the first question, is to try to take a more inductive approach. If you picture, if I was to tell you something, you can picture an arrow going towards you of information from me to you. But if you were to ask me a question, perhaps that arrow goes the other way around, and I think if you were asking the question, you might feel a lot more attached to the answer. So that's a kind of empathetic way of learning, which we as human beings appreciate. And as an artist, I'm very conscious of, there's no painting in the world that's really going to tell anybody how to believe or think. It's something you come to and you either like it or you don't. So I think as a painter, I'm very interested in, how do I empathetically put myself in the position of my viewer? How do I become a good viewer of my own work and of this issue? I think it's so political and it's so huge, and there's people on both sides who have been hurt. I'll speak about this tomorrow in my talk about the role of beauty given a subject that has death as one of its primary, factors. How can you even enjoy a painting about a nuclear weapon? How can you even look at a photograph? There's this idea of disaster porn, and that's not just nuclear. It's also, we have environmental, disasters. You see images of a tsunami, or living in New York, images of 9/11. This sort of cathartic experience with other people's pain. I think it's really on the tip of this issue, and my response as an artist is not to shy away from that, but to empathetically put myself in that position, and kind of like what Nina was saying, it's my role isn't really to tell anybody how to feel or giving information. My role is to be a witness to my own response and try to put that into paint.
No, I think it's really complex and really complicated. So there's danger in this beauty, I think, but I also think that there's a necessity to communicate in this way, to investigate things in this way, to try to make a visual language that helps everyone hopefully helps a conversation, continue about all these things that are occurring, and I think that it's not as easy to quantify at times as it would be with language perhaps, but in my experience, even dealing with the scientific community, they've learned a lot through art. I've had scientists I've collaborated with who, just through things I made, experiments that we kind of created together, they were able to figure out to further some of their research and some of their investigations. So I think it's very important, all these different ways of working, because we're talking about something so complex and something that doesn't have a true representation at a lot of levels. So this kind of, I think all the work in the show is successful in different ways, right? But it also probably fails in certain ways too, and I think it's interesting to think about that, like what is a representation of all of this?
It's interesting to contemplate an opposition between teaching, didacticism on the one hand, and beauty on the other hand. Who were the artists who did these assemblages of plastic they found on the beach in the hydrologic exhibit?
Judith Selby Lang and Richard Lang.
Yeah, and so these artists in the last exhibit we had, they had this video that was part of the exhibit and included an interview, and the final statement in that video was, ugliness is not the opposite of beauty, indifference is the opposite of beauty. And so I very much think that, so maybe beauty is the inverse of didacticism somehow. Maybe beauty for somebody experiencing a work of art is that they're attending in a certain way, that they're receptive and aware in a certain way. One of the texts that we're reading in our class is John Dewey's Art as Experience, which really positions one's attention at the center of an artistic experience.
I wouldn't call any of our work beautiful, but it has an aesthetic, right? It has an aesthetic of bureaucracy, and we call it a bureaucratic camp. But that doesn't mean that there isn't pleasure, and I think that form can mean something really different and a different way of working. So for me, there's a politics to our form that includes pleasure. We describe their workshops as fostering seriously pleasurable critical thinking, with the idea that being in that space of aesthetic play, of design, of thinking through imagery and dialogue with other people is actually the core of that aesthetic experience. And then the package in which it's presented to another audience is kind of speaking to another aesthetic language, this wishful establishment of an agency that is kind of campy, but also very sincere. And so we try to walk this line that isn't really about beauty, it's about a different kind of contemplative aesthetic play.
Thank you. So now I'd like to, do you want?
No, I was just gonna, okay, I'll say something very, very brief. I was just gonna say that I think that playfulness is part of maybe what can be an opening up. So I just edited this book called Restoring Layered Landscapes, which is about dealing with rethinking ecological restoration in the context of the landscapes that have these kind of complex socio-political histories, where the kind of traditional value in ecological restoration has been this what's called historical fidelity. The way that's been interpreted is going back to kind of a pre-disturbance condition, like before humans make it look like, bring the bison back, like a former chemical weapons plant outside of Denver, Rocky Mountain Arsenal. Bring the bison back, reintroduce black-footed ferrets. Like, this is all very cool. Like, I'm not in any way opposed to it, but the worry is that you obscure some of these other really important layers. The layer of time when this was a chemical weapons plant, and the sarin bombs and VX nerve gas and other things that they manufactured there, and then it became a pesticide manufacturing facility, and the local communities interacted with that place in complex ways. So, one thing that we've thought about is, Sarah and Shiloh Krupar have this wishful agency. I think one of our visions is to to think about restoration, how could there be interventions like on the restored landscape that would maybe be playful? One of my colleagues from the Netherlands has this idea of installing like, you know, life-size plastic toy soldiers like around the refuge, and just to have them looking at the prairie dogs and the prairie dogs looking back at them. What's the message? I mean, I think it's not sort of clearly stated, but it opens up a lot of possibilities for creative reinterpretation of the site.
Can I jump off that? 'Cause, yeah, I like the introduction of the word play into this conversation, and as an artist, I spend a lot of time questioning, you know, what is art, what makes something beautiful. I think that for me, a lot of answers are really coming out of biology and ecology in terms of play is something we do as humans, and it's something that's built into the way we work with the world, and I see painting as an extended form of kind of cerebral, very visual play. One of the most playful parts of painting for me is color, and then bouncing back to the thought about beauty versus indifference. There's a college, Peter Warshaw, has anyone heard of? Well, he gave a talk about light and color and the evolution of color. That changed my thinking about this stuff, because in a lot of art you think of color as secondary to the form, or maybe secondary to the subject matter, or you know we worry about nuclear landscapes first, and then we add on the pretty decorative part that'll make it palatable. But he goes the other way. He says color is something that's been built in to life on planet Earth since day one. I mean, we have the sun, we have organisms that are evolving. We evolved to go towards certain colors and away from others, so it's built in this idea of attraction and repulsion. I think I surface that in my paintings, and tomorrow I'll talk about like this concept of the apocalyptic sublime, the idea that something that's beautiful can be terrifying. And for me, I think it depends on your character or your sort of personality. Sometimes something can't be beautiful without a little bit of fear, and that's where this subject starts taking off for me.
I want to speak to play. This is an important topic, I guess, the concept of play, but I realized I had this sort of sick fascination when I was searching for these declassified images, or the process of declassification. It felt like a game to me, and I was looking at these images of just, well, that all I could decipher from them was, you know, landscape, and that these were highly classified images, and people have been paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to create systems of classification around them, and that I felt like a spy or like this post-nuclear ninja finding them. And I don't understand really what was fun about that for me, but it's something that I've related to in my work in the strange way that I have that strangeness in my brain, and that I find that fun has then allowed other people's curiosity to jump off from that and learn from it. And so I don't know if beauty is there, but kind of a meticulousness of attention that it has to be pleasurable for us as the artist to continue maintaining focus to do these larger projects that we've all been involved with.
Thank you. So now I'd like to open it up to the audience if you have questions for any or all of our panelists. Yeah.
Eric, I think you have a.
You know, Mike.
You have a Bitterroot in the collection of your paintings. I wondered what that inclusion brought to your work.
Yeah, so the question was about a watercolor I have of the Bitterroot flower, and thank you for recognizing that. I'm very interested in this dichotomy of, you know, beauty and fear and ugliness, and I don't know. So a flower is a symbol of beauty, and I wanted something to offset. In my work, I often find I'm kind of trying to counter myself. So I did a lot of painting of the flat territory around my hometown in eastern Washington, and I eventually decided I needed to counter that with something sharper. I did a lot of these nuclear landscapes, and then I decided, well, for all that sort of depressing sort of subject matter, it would be nice to have something to counter that. And I found like a flower, you know, as a good counterweight. And the Lewissia flower itself after some research, I didn't know this, but is a historic, I think it's the state flower of Montana, is that right?
Yes.
It was, there are people here who know this so much more than me. There's I guess it was discovered by Meriwether Lewis of Lewis and Clark, and it's this scrappy little plant that grows where other things don't. I mean, it's kind of carved out an ecological niche where it's too dry for other things. And specifically, it does grow on Nevada test site or nearby, which is unusual. So for me, it's a good counter, and it sets up in my paintings this dichotomy between like the ugliness of war and then the hope of the future. You know, it's also about time and these landscapes that'll last for tens of millions of years, and a flower that might not last more than 10 weeks.
Hi, most of you have talked about atomic landscapes within the United States. And it's always struck me as both deeply ironic and symbolic, if I'm correct, that the uranium in the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki came from the Congo. And I find we don't talk about depleted uranium that was left behind in Iraq, which has caused horrendous birth defects and high rates of cancer. And, you know, I don't know what else to say except, you know, when you talk about traces and memory, I mean, there's a very living suffering for the people of Iraq. So I wondered if any of you have considered landscapes elsewhere.
Thank you for the great question. So the National TLC Services explicitly focused on within the United States effects for several reasons. One is that we're here, and these are the landscapes that we grew up in. So my collaborator Shiloh Krupar's from Richland and Denver. Her father worked at Rocky Flats, among other places. So this is really her home territory. And so I think we have an obligation to kind of speak from where we are, but not overlook the international ramifications. But we simply aren't equipped to responsibly address those through anything other than the kind of refraction of the media, given the distance and the kind of budget that would be needed and commitment that would be needed to say, go and live in Iraq for years in order to be able to do a project like that. I think the other reason, which is less specifically strategic or question of resources, is that I believe that we all are to some degree responding to a context where the official story of the United States is that we emerged unscathed from World War II, and that we haven't been invaded since the War of 1812. So somehow since the Civil War, we don't see that war has actually profoundly shaped our landscapes and our culture. And so I think all of us, to some degree, are contesting that notion of American exceptionalism through our work.
I just want to tell a somewhat horrifying anecdote. I was at a Concerned Citizens for Nuclear Safety meeting in which the Los Alamos Labs was releasing their newest exposure analysis, which they had to do through a third-party analysis. And they're usually, this one was about 140,000 pages long, just these huge documents. And they decided that the tagline for the exposure document was, "The solution to pollution is equal distribution." And so they were really trying to find offshore places to house nuclear waste, because they think it's, even though we have done the greatest proliferation of weapons, they think that it's a step towards world peace and world health to equally distribute it around the world.
I'll just say that I agree that we need to be aware and attentive of the kind of many tentacles of the nuclear issue. And I think, although my own work also has been focused in the United States. I think one of my broader concerns or interests is in helping us think through the ways in which war, I mean, I think we sometimes think about war as something that's confined to like, well, certainly it's not confined to the battlefield anymore, but like what is the battlefield, right? But confined to these sort of, these places, these theaters of war where, you know, where bombs are being dropped and so on. And I think we less frequently really acknowledge how deeply, you know, people's lives, landscapes, health, all those things, cultural resources and places that have had, you know, thousands of years of meaning for people are destroyed in the process of war. And that, you know, there's incredible devastation. I mean, it's also that we have an anthropologist on the faculty here who studies, and this is again US, but PTSD and, you know, I think the psychic effects of war and so on. So I guess I see this exhibit as sort of one piece of a broader interrogation of war and the way in which war and militarism actually extend much beyond where we try to kind of contain them. So I mean, and I guess I would also say that my students are going to be doing some work to kind of intervene in the exhibit in collaboration with Jessica Hunter-Larson. And one of the things I think that would be possible there is to think about, I mean, we're doing that sort of in relation to, through the lens of environmental justice. One of the possibilities would be to sort of bring out you know, narratives or dimensions of this story that are untold or that aren't represented or aren't foregrounded by the exhibit. So certainly your question, I mean, there might be opportunities there for students to explore that. I guess, well, I'll say one last thing, which is that I think there's this sort of spatial dimension that you brought out, and then I think there's this temporal dimension that we kind of touched on. But Jessica had a last question on her list that she sent to us, which was about, you know, much of this exhibition deals with nuclear history. What do you see as the most pressing issues for the future? And I think, you know, Sarah's point that the Cold War is not really over is a really crucial one, and one that I think I also would like to see sort of come out of this exhibit. I was just you know, the U.S. still has a nuclear weapons arsenal that's active, and the U.S. is actively working to develop new, smaller nuclear weapons. And I was just reviewing a story that I read in the New York Times I think it was last spring. I can't remember precisely when it was, but there was a general who was nuclear advisor to Obama who was quoted in the article, and he was talking about this move to developing sort of more smaller, more tactical nuclear weapons. And one of the things he said was that, even though he wasn't necessarily opposed to them, was that what going smaller does is to make the weapons more thinkable. So I guess, you know, I hope that we're cognizant of the ways in which this nuclear issue is so much, very much with us today, and that not only do we need to kind of figure out better ways to grapple with the past, but also how to go forward.
I'm intrigued by the phrase landscapes, because a lot of you, for instance, have named the landscape the nuclear test site, which might also be called Pawnee's National Land or Western Shoshone National Land. And nuclear atomic landscapes might also include the salmon, which are showing up off the coast of the Columbia River with plutonium in them, which is coming most likely from Hanford leakage of nuclear materials. And it's a landscape that expands much further than identified atomic weapons production sites. And similarly with Fukushima, the amount of seascape that has been polluted by that horrible accident. But what we name as the landscape, what is the landscape? The landscape, in fact, seems to me, is the whole planet, isn't it?
Right, so I regard myself as a landscape painter, and in my world, there's a tendency to think of landscapes as these sort of tame, bucolic pictures of flowers and trees. But I see landscape a little bit like you're indicating as a wider topic, and I see this topic as really only, kind of the tip of a greater iceberg about the confluence of technology, environment, and conflict in our contemporary world. So what is the landscape, what is the battlefield? I think about cyber warfare. If you consider, the dissemination of radiation around the world, now consider the dissemination of information around the world. Consider the idea of topics where we can't see what's going on. It's kind of untraceable who the attacking actors are, and yet we're victimized by this. So for me, this is a contemporary topic for more than just being about nukes, which are still around. And I recommend the book Command and Control. It's a great book about contemporary nuclear questions. But it's also about what it's like to be, a very fallible human individual, community, species in a highly technologically driven, accelerated landscape.
I think you're exactly right. I think that with beginning of all this nuclear testing and the bombing and everything that's gone on since, it's impacted the entire Earth. And there's actually if you think there's a term of the Anthropocene, and this is a term of that scientists are proposing as a new epoch that really began with the first nuclear test. Because it's something where human interaction. Human interactions and the natural world have become permanently entangled, so there's no separation of it, and there's a permanent layer of all of this in geologic time now from the testing. So the entire world really has been permanently changed.
Yeah, I think that, any of us could experience this process of starting from the iconic, sort of the symbol of a certain era or occurrence and move beyond it with a little bit of reflection. And so in my case, electronic music doesn't seem to have especially much to do with warfare or the Cold War. And then when you start looking at the history, you realize, oh wait, magnetic tape was a Nazi invention. We're in a screening room, right? Cinema. I recommend you all Paul Virilio's book, The Logistics of Vision or Cinema, in which he details the way that cinema technology arose in a kind of technological warfare of propaganda technology between the United States and Germany during World War II. More specifically, in terms of the Cold War for electronic music, in Argentina, there was an attempt to set up a nuclear program a bit southeast of Buenos Aires. And what happened was that program failed after there was a military coup, and much of the equipment that was there that could be repurposed was transported from the failed site back into the city to be at universities. And the composer Francisco Kropfel wandered into a School of Architecture and Linguistics, I believe those were the departments housed in the building. And he was trying to start an electronic music program, and he went to the person who was in charge of, I think it was the linguistics lab, because they had some equipment for analyzing speech in different ways. And he said, is there any way we could start using some of this equipment to make electronic music? And he said, well, would this help? And he opened the door, and there was an entire room full of oscillators that had been repurposed from this failed nuclear program. So as soon as you scratch the surface a little bit, you begin to move beyond what seems to be the obvious symbol of things and realize how far-reaching all of this is in any discipline, I think.
I'm going to go back a little bit to the word land because I think about it a lot. And for me, when people talk about land, they're talking about this material that's underneath this building and that you might plant your bulbs in the spring to turn into flowers. And land use is the process of using it, and then landscape is how we frame and look at that land use of land. And I feel like I'm on a personal mission to understand land more like time, because we're constantly a swim in our anthropogenic land relationship right now. There's no way to separate ourselves from it. So the Anthropocene in the sense of time and that we're constantly in a relationship to land is so important to me, and that there really is no synthetic anything. Everything comes from the land. I think the word synthetic is this idea that something is made by a machine. The materials of it still come from the land. So I'm on a little bit of a personal crusade for myself to always be reminding myself that we're products of land and land use, and landscape is just how we're framing it. And I think the atomic era really did kick off kind of this understanding of that in a different way. So I just appreciate your question a lot.
Yeah, thank you. That resonates with me as well. I'm really interested as also not just in the land being transformed, but the way that nuclear technologies expose the permeability of bodies, and we ourselves as products of this environment that we are always making with the matter that pre-existed us. And so I think it not just challenges us away from this view of land as a view, as this thing that we behold, but also it complicates our idea of ourselves as us, as separate from it, insofar as our very DNA has all been mutated by these products of our own science and technology relating to uranium, a naturally occurring element. So I think it has it's a really politically and poetically kind of productive path to walk down to trouble that human non-human dichotomy that's really kind of struck at the heart of Western culture for centuries.
Yeah, I'm curious about the moral landscape. Starting kind of with Einstein's original quote, which I think we're all familiar with, and following that with the scientists that worked on the bomb, the misgivings that they had, and then as mainstream theologians in the 50s and 60s began to try to comprehend the moral landscape that atomic weapons brought into view, or they basically fractured the old landscape. How can the art world, maybe it's in that display, I looked at this display and I'm not, maybe it's in your work, how you've dealt with the moral landscape and how that interacts with other definitions of landscape.
Since I spoke to it so personally before, I will answer it for myself again. I just, for me as an artist, the act of making is the greatest thing I can offer. It's the time spent contemplating and exposing to myself. If I'm lucky, if there's an audience, I'm not aspiring to have an audience. The greatest thing I can do with my own time is contemplate and inform myself. And so in looking at all of these situations that you just described, I can bring my own attention to it, which I think it sounds kind of vapid when I'm saying it. There's such huge moral impacts to what's happened with the landscape. So I'm at a pause from your question. Thank you for asking it.
I'm curious whether you mean specifically the decision to drop the bomb as part, or the development of the weapons, or what we do now as in terms of the moral calculus.
Just a little bit of background. The people who originally wrestled with the question, we don't have any categories to compute this on a moral scale. We've blown them apart. And I would say the legacy of that is that kind of permanently blew apart some of our ability to make moral judgments about war and about the weapons that have ensued from nuclear weapons, including cyber war.
Yeah. I think that our response to that is to look less at the bombs themselves, but at the set of relationships that are required for those to be produced, and the ways that communities and individual lives are brought up through that process and often devastated. And so the moral stance that we try to embody is a politics of care for the forms of collateral damage in that process. So I am not a person who's charged with choosing to use or not use to line out a particular weapons program, but I am a person who can be in dialogue with people who are involved in that process, and to try to instantiate a politics of care for all of the effects, which are very wide-ranging, prior to, at the point of application.
I really appreciate the question, and I think everyone here probably has, some awareness and some thought into that. From my point of view as an artist, I don't think I really have a moral point to grind on that. Let me put that another way. I don't regard myself either as pro-nuclear or anti-nuclear, or pro-war or anti-war, because as an artist, what I feel I can do is bring sort of what Nina was saying, a power of observation and my personal witness to the table. And honestly, if I felt like I had a better grip on my political point of view, I probably should do it through something besides art. For me, painting is something that is gloriously ineffective. People don't get killed because of a painting usually. And that's his benefit, because back to the landscape I'm thinking about isn't really this stuff or even this topic. I'm thinking about this landscape. That's the way my landscape does. Like crazy. How do we think about these things? I think you're absolutely right that the unleashing of the powers of nuclear physics just floored everyone's moral compass. They scrambled the moral compass, and honestly, it's only going faster and more. I use the example of cyber warfare advisedly. I think it's analogous in many ways. For one thing, it's unprecedented. It's a technological product of creativity, of ideas that were in some ways very idealistic and creative in the same way that as an artist I'm a creative person. And yet, how do we this place where now you can have unnamed attackers leveraging untold potential on vulnerable targets at any given time, any given place, never know what hit them. I think that also cyber warfare has an analogy to nuclear warfare in that it tends to militarize the populace, so that even a civilian might be working on a weapon kind of without their knowledge. And it calls into question everybody's actions. We talk about the damage to the landscape in the Anthropocene. That's not something that started in 1945, neither is something that started from European cultures, or even, the Native Americans were burning this country well before, we landed. And I think that's important, that we see this as part of a continuum. The breakdown really is between us and else. And as an artist, I'm considering that as well. The difference, I'm used to thinking of myself as an observer, and everything else is kind of something I observe, or I'm a human being and we're in this natural environment, but that's not the way it plays out. And that's not the way nature works. And the continuation of warfare through our technology the scale is surprising.
We wanted to offer in response that artistic representation can often be a vehicle for self-reflection, and it might be the case that one is unaware of the moral landscape, of the moral dimension of landscapes until one represents one. So the composer and music theorist R. Murray Schafer in Canada liked to do an exercise with his students where he would have them draw a city. He would say, draw me a picture of a city, how it will look in 10 years or something like that, 100 years from now. The future, draw me the future. And students would draw these pictures, two-dimensional representations of pictures with like 6 helicopters like in the sky. And then R. Murray Schafer would say, have you ever heard the sound of 6 helicopters in the sky at once? And it wasn't, until that moment of representation that one begins to think about the soundscape as something that has an ethical dimension. It might be the first time people think, well, silence might be a resource that only some people can afford, or that it's somehow embroiled in power structures in different ways. And maybe you could speak to the way that that plays out in the design charrettes that you do as kind of like points of reflection.
Well, honestly, we haven't actually had occasion to consider sound very much. So one of the things that we ask people to do, and we live in a very visual and linguistic culture, is to bring in a piece of evidence or an object, image, we say sound, or words that serve as evidence or a metaphor for atomic legacies. And nobody has brought in a sound. But they have brought in chants, songs, images, objects. I have some.
This is a great segment, actually.
So, shall we?
Yes, I think, thank you all for your questions, and there'll be an opportunity maybe to chat a little bit more over in the gallery. And there's lots more programs with Atomic Landscapes, so please do come back. And I want to thank you all. Speaking maybe to the specificity of this exhibition, it is, I believe, a starting point for much broader conversations. I wanted to look at what was truly in our own backyard, our histories and our legacies that exist right here in the Southwest in landscapes that we find very difficult to see for many ways, psychologically, physically. Our access to them can be complicated, and our responses to them can be complicated. But the intention of the exhibition was to start with the specific and then raise many, many more questions about the implications globally, environmentally, and through the future. So I want to thank you all, our panelists and our audience, for fulfilling my desire for the exhibition and taking this in some really interesting and wonderful places and giving us a lot to think about. So this is a great idea program. Thank you. And now we'd like to invite you to participate in part of the TLC process. And Sarah's going to explain what that's going to look like.
So at the workshop on Saturday, one of our participants brought waste from an abandoned uranium mine in western Colorado. And she sort of performatively scattered it around the room with the desire that it implicates all of us in the act of cleaning it up. So it is not toxic, it's not hazardous, but it is waste that we all need to dispose of. So I have a bag of this, and I would like to distribute items to members of the audience, and then we will walk out to the dumpster. Is there a dumpster in the back? Yeah. And ritualistically put the waste away.
Anyone who's willing to.
All right.
And, ready up for it? We promise it won't hurt you. Anyone on the panel? Is this safe to emergency storage?
Okay, okay.
That's it, I'm sorry.
Oh.
Yeah, didn't bring that much.
Yeah.
So we can do all the sets.
Yeah. That's one way to memorialize things.
Yeah.
Create another monument.